I'm going to break down how I remade this shot from the foundation title sequence, and 4 key lessons I learned along the way. In my goal to improve as an artist, I need to learn from some of the best, and that's why I chose this from the Legends Over Imaginary Forces, who are behind some of the coolest title sequences out there. So let's break it down.
There are only a couple of parts to this. We have a flag cloth simulation, particles pouring off the flag, the static flagpole, a bit of fog in the background, and some additional particles in the foreground. All the particles look like they're made from like sharp crystals or something. So let's get this guy built. First starting with a heavily subdivided grid to be the base of our flag fabric, and quickly build a little pole and place it all in our scene. Then I find an example of the flag online and use that as a texture to drive the color. And using the UV tools, place it on our flag. Next I need to create some points to stick to the flagpole. And I do this procedurally by using a cube, placing it on the corner, and then copying of it so it's completely procedural. Throwing that into a group node, and then putting that group in our vellum sim. I changed the angle of the flag so I could let gravity do its thing. And then I just played around with the stiffness and the bend attributes to get the base feel of the flag. Added a pop wind in the direction that I want with some noise to give it that turbulence feel. And then I just iterated like crazy till I got the look I wanted. And well, here's the flag in all its glory. Let's flip it back to the right way so we can test how this looks in context. Looks good. Now we've got the base of the motion set up, let's place the camera. Because I'll be animating this camera, I use a null to place our center point. And then using the rule of thirds, I'm lining up where this shot will land. And then once that's locked in, all I do is animate the Y rotation on this null to get that whip in camera move, which is really quick on the first few frames and then tapers out to a slower move so it's never quite static. Next up, I want to create that detail where the flag seems torn or worn towards the end. And to do that, I'm going to use my clip technique. So first, I reset my geometry to its rest position, allowing me to make all these next attributes on a static mesh. But you have to make sure you still store the animation on another attribute. In this case, rest A for animation. First, I add a linear gradient with priority towards the right side of the flag. Add a little noise to break it up, then some more noise to break it up even more, and then add some even more high frequency noise to break it up even more, just to get that more intense detail. Then using this mop's fall off attribute, I pull it forward into Z space, which then allows me to use the clip node to cut off anything past a certain point, before finally resetting the animation of the flag. And because we did all these little adjustments on a static mesh, it means our cut and our mask won't change or shift during the animation. Well, the geometry is done, so I'm going to clean that up and put in an out node. If we look back at the reference, we can see that the flag isn't just base geo though, it's made up of heaps of particles or sand. And to do that, I'm going to scatter some points over the flag. But there's a catch with the scatter node here. If you pump animated geometry into it, it will rescatter on every single frame, leaving an absolute mess. So there's a cheeky way to fix that. And you freeze the geometry on the first frame and scatter all the points over it. And then in the scatter node, I turn on the primnum and primuv attribute, and always turn on the ID attribute as well. And then using the attribute interpolate node, by pumping in the points in the first and the animated geometry in the second, we get our points sticking to the animated geometry. Let's up the point count to 600,000 to make it super dense. Add some noise to the Z position to thicken it up a little bit so it doesn't look like all the points are on a plane. I noticed later on the edge was too smooth, so I added some noise to only break up the edge of the flag. This looks gross here, but it fits in later on, trust me. I do what I always do and add a random ID for each point, which can come in handy in texturing. Give all the points a really tiny p-scale and output them. If we look back at our reference, we can see that these particles don't just appear like round particles. They kind of have a crystal-like look to them. Because sand or little crystals are actually like really jagged rocks, it didn't make sense to use circles. And a little hack to get this effect is you can just use cubes. So I scattered some cubes onto our points, but it doesn't look quite right just yet. But when you add some random rotation to this, even with just the viewport view, we're seeing it get pretty close to the look, where circles just didn't quite do it. and then just outputted the pole geometry and also scattered some points over the pole as well, with those same attributes applied. The next step is the bulk of this project, and that's creating the dust particles that come off the flag. But if we look back at our reference, we can notice the dust isn't coming off the entire flag, but is coming off at the end of it with a little bit of noise and variation on where it's coming from the further it gets in. So let's create those attributes. We're going to go back up to our rest geometry and use those MOPS fall-offs again, with a linear gradient to start, with a little bit of noise, a little bit more high-frequency noise, and also another attribute with some animated noise. And also, this one will come in handy in a second, but separating the top and the bottom of the flag. And coming back to this wrangle, I just used all of those attributes and used some threshold sliders to remove whatever's not there, giving us this animated source for our particles.
The first key learning is just-in-time information. I spend so much time on YouTube cataloging tutorials and marking them for when they come in handy later. So when I started doing this particle simulation, after a few attempts on my own, I realized I need to go to Voxide's channel. He knows exactly how to just nail that particle look.
And I've linked that tutorial set in the description here. I used it pretty intensely, and I didn't follow his tutorial exactly. I had a specific goal in mind and I needed to get my shot done. So I just took what I needed and moved on. Created 2 points off to the right-hand side, act as a goal for the particles to shoot towards, kind of in replacement of wind. And I animated their position using a noise to get a little bit of variance, but only on the y-axis. I like to use a low particle count to do my initial iterations on and then up-res that later. All the effects here happen within this geometry vault. And when I open it up, it looks like a spaghetti mess, but this will make sense if we break it down layer by layer. So let's do that now. All this is getting piped into the velocity on our output. So let's bring that up here. And we're just gonna view the first one, which is our initial velocity strength, which is just coming from the geometry moving. It's subtle. The next is subtracting those points from the position of our particles, which will give us the exact direction that we want the particles to go, effectively giving us our wind or suction. But if I pipe in the attribute that separated the top and the bottom of the flag and direct them individually towards point A and point B, we can get 2 streams coming off, which if we look back at our reference, we can see is happening. Next is I use the age of the particles between 0 and 0.7 to effectively blend between our initial velocity and this wind suction, giving us this. Now we're going to go down to the noise section, and I'm going to bring our output node down here as well. I'll remove some of these wires to simplify it, and we're just going to pipe in the position directly into our large noise, which you can see is just chaotic and doesn't move anywhere. Then use the age of the particle to effectively grow this noise amplitude over time, giving us this. Next, I want to animate the position of the noise a little bit. Firstly, on the time axis down the bottom here, and I'm using the time counter to animate this continuously. This will give us this effect. And I'm doing the same on the X position of the noise, giving us this effect. And I randomly offset the position of the noise for some particles, just to give it a little bit more variance. Now let's blend that noise in with our original wind, and we get this. And I pretty much do the same thing for a smaller noise, with some slight differences. So let's replace that and we get this, which the noise is much subtler and much smaller, but mixed with our large noise, it looks really nice. Now finally, I want to add some chaos. So I have a noise that is just pure chaos, And I have the age of the particles. Turn this on right at the end just to really break it up and add some entropy to it. As we can see here, it's really subtle, but it's right at the end of this particle simulation. Now let's just pump up that particle count to get our final look. This looks super cool. Now, I didn't just have all the right settings from the get-go like you're seeing here. There was a lot of iteration going in, just adjusting the noise a little bit, adjusting the time that the noise is added in, and same with the wind and also that chaotic noise at the end. And sometimes this just takes time to get right. And this is the main part of the shot, so I did want it to look good. So I spent hours, I think 6 or 7 hours making this work. And occasionally I'd come back and change it again and again and again and again. And like our flag particles, added a random number, the orientation, and set our P scale. So when we copy cubes to this, it looks right. We're not done with these particles just yet. If we look in the reference, we can see the start of the simulation. It's really thick and luscious, but as that simulation goes on, the particles start to thin out.
And the second key learning is not needing the simulation to get you 100% of the way there. One awesome thing about Houdini is you can do so much in the post-sim. So I'm going to break down how I improved the particle simulation post-simulation.
I'm going to pull my particle sim into a new geometry container so we can work more specifically on this task. Now I know what I need to do. I need to age the particles a little bit. And I've got those attributes already from the simulation. We've got life and we've got age. And in fact, I want a large chunk of the particles to start dying off around 1.5 seconds. But I want to create way more variance in that. I don't want them to just die. I want them to scale down to nothing so the simulation doesn't feel jittery and it feels smooth still. So first up, I need to select the particles. So using a random number generator and a threshold, I essentially select my particles and split them into 2 streams. The first stream are the ones that are going to be thinned, and the second stream are the ones that are not going to be affected at all. And through trial and error, I found that I wanted a lot selected. So I have a heap of code on this one that I'm going to chuck up on screen now and essentially run you through what's happening. Now I need the particle's life to be around 1.5 seconds, but I don't want them to all have that life. I want some variance, so each individual particle gets a random value around 1.5 seconds with a give or take of about 0.5 seconds. So if I change the life here, you can see the particles either being older or younger when they get killed off. And then I create a normalized age, which is essentially dividing the life that particle has by the age it currently has. That'll give you a value between 0 and 1. Then a cool trick using a fit node, when the particle gets to about 50% of its life, start scaling it down from 100% to 0%. Then I have a little if statement at the bottom just to remove any particles after they're dead. So here's our original simulation. Here are the particles that have not been selected, that get the full life. And here are the particles that have been selected and get killed off. And combined, they look like this. I'm happy with that. Now the next few elements is just adding the particles in the foreground, which is pretty much the exact same premise as the other particles, except I'm sourcing it from a couple spheres just off to the left of the scene, and doing all those same things to it. You can see in our geometry vault, it's a very similar layout, just maybe a bit more simplified. Then I added some volume up for the top right-hand corner, and the scene is ready to jump into Solaris now.
The third key learning is testing the look dev as you go, so you can be constantly testing the simulation with lighting and texturing already applied, so you can change it if needed. Solaris, while annoying at times, is really good for doing this.
And so here's my scene in Solaris. I'm going to feed down the tree and show you how I built this. But pretty much I just brought my geometry in with SOP imports or through USD. All our particles, I just used the native instancer inside of Solaris to give us all our particles. So here's the pole, the foreground particles, the flag particles, which I did cache, and the main dust particles, which I also cached. Setting up the scene in Solaris like this was a different approach for me. I learned this from Pixel Ninja, and I'm not going to go in depth, but I've linked his video in the description. Next is the materials, where a bulk of the magic happens. So I've got our particle material here, and I'm just bringing in our color, which I did change to black and white to give me exact control in the material editor. So I remapped those black and white values to our red and yellow that I need for the flag. And using that random number that I generated, I'm slightly adjusting the hue just to give a little bit of variation between all the particles. This just makes it look a little bit more realistic, because not every particle is going to be the exact same color. And you can see when I boost this, it gives us a lot of randomness. I only have a tiny bit of variance in that color. I love this approach because it allows me to set the base color and then just add the variance either side. And then that same randomness, I isolated about 30% of the particles that needed to be like very metal. And now if I show you if every particle is metal, we get this, which while might be accurate in terms of every particle is metal, it doesn't give us the look we wanted. So isolating about 30% just allowed me to have a bit of a sheen on some of the particles. And I have a similar approach for the geometry, just remapping the color. Let's move on to lighting. I've only got a handful of lights here that I'm going to show you one by one. Here's the key light, which also kind of looks like a rim, but it's kind of giving our main lighting. Our fill, which is kind of filling in the rest of the left-hand side of the flag. Our ambient lighting, which is just boosting the darkness very uniformly. So I'm going to show you where they're placed. That key light is just right up to the top. The fill is a little bit more in the front and it's much larger, giving us softer shadows. The ambient's obviously right in the middle. This next light is just for the front particles and it's obviously right in the front. And the fog one is up in the top right-hand corner. And now using light linking, I have made sure those lights are only affect their specific objects, and those specific objects are only being affected by their specific light. When I rendered this, I broke it into 3 different passes. We have the main scene, which is just the flag really, with all its lighting, fog by itself, and just the front particles. By doing this, I'm able to move this into compositing and deal with all the little headaches that happen after.
We don't have to nail everything in camera. We can use compositing to get us the rest of the way there.
I set up some AOVs for compositing. We have the depth pass, puzzle mat on the flag, which separates all those individual elements, a material mat, which just isolates that logo and the colors that are the same as the logo. And that's it. I just rendered all these out and then I throw them into After Effects for compositing. And the cool thing about this workflow is I can speed up the render because when I'm rendering the flag, I'm using its exact settings. And when I'm rendering the fog, I'm using settings that are specific to that. The last key learning, and that is doing the last 20% in Composite. Just like we don't need the sim to do all the work, we also don't need the renderer to do all the work. Sometimes you can get a lot further and simpler in Composite rather than trying to get it out of render and camera. As cool and easy as it would be if it just worked out of render, doing it in Composite is fine and is actually how a lot of people work. And in compositing, I just brought in those 3 passes, the flag, the front particles, which are kind of hard to see, and the fog. And brought all together, it looks like this. I'm going to break down step by step what compositing I've done here. It's pretty simple though. I just brought in our mats, isolated the pole, the logo, and the depth mat. Now I created a fake background by just animating some noise, just to fill out the background a little bit more than our volume was. And all it is a gradient ramp with a noise that's been animated, some tinting and color change to get it about accurate, and see that in comparison to our volume. And when joined, it looks like this, which looks really full on, but when we get to the grade, a lot of that will fade into the background. The next is adding our flag, which I've just got a little curves adjustment to lift the shadows. I darkened the pole, and I did some color adjustment on the logo, which I was able to isolate with that material matte pass. And then we have our front particles, which are pretty subtle, but they fill out the bottom of the frame. Next up is the overall grade, which really brings it a lot closer to our reference on the side. So the grade just has an exposure adjustment, desaturated a little bit, but dropping the gamma, another little saturation adjustment, and hue shift for a final curves adjustment, just to get in that luxe spot. And one of the last bits is a bit of bloom or glow that really just brings the render completely into its own. I added some fake motion blur just at the start, just to dirty it up a little bit and make it feel like it's in movement. And that's it. Then when we compare that to what we got out of the camera and what we did in compositing, it looks like this. Massive difference. which is why you can't always rely on what comes out of the camera. You can do so much in compositing.
I always have to remember that because you really do just have to trust the process.
And so here was my final shot. While not 1-to-1, I think it's close enough.